The assembly hall stretched for nearly a kilometer, its vaulted ceiling lost in artificial clouds that drifted through projected skies. Delegate chambers rose in concentric rings around the central platform, each one housing representatives from the 217 species that comprised the Galactic Council. The architecture was designed to inspire awe, to remind every being present that they were part of something greater than themselves, something that had endured for 60,000 years. Thomas Garrett stood on the central platform, hands clasped behind his back, watching the chaos unfold around him. He was 43 years old, with gray threading through dark hair that he kept cut military short. His face was weathered, lined from too many years spent in recycled ship air and artificial gravity. He wore the simple black uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, no medals, no decorations, just a small patch on his shoulder showing a blue marble against the void. The Vesk ambassador was speaking, his 3 mandibles clicking rapidly as he gestured with 4 of his 6 arms. Thomas didn't bother listening anymore. He'd heard it all before, in a dozen different variations, from a dozen different species. The words changed, but the message remained constant. Humanity was too aggressive, too unpredictable, too dangerous to be trusted with full council membership. The human military expansion continues unchecked, the Vesk hissed, his translator rendering his words in flat, emotionless standard. 17 new battle groups commissioned in the last solar cycle alone. They fortify their borders while claiming peaceful intent. They stockpile weapons while preaching cooperation. Thomas felt something twist in his chest, something dark and bitter that he'd been swallowing down for the past 6 months. He'd come to this hall with hope once, back when he still believed that reason and evidence could overcome prejudice, back when he thought that humanity's contributions, the medical advances, the agricultural innovations, the quantum drive modifications that had cut interstellar travel time by 40%, would speak louder than fear. He'd been wrong. The Trell representative rose next, her crystalline body refracting the hall's light into rainbow patterns that danced across the walls. Humanity's economic practices undermine established trade protocols. They refuse to honor the traditional profit-sharing arrangements. They insist on direct negotiation rather than working through approved intermediaries. Because your approved intermediaries take 60% off the top, Thomas said quietly, not bothering to activate his microphone. No one was listening anyway. The pattern had become clear months ago. Every proposal humanity submitted was delayed, referred to committee, studied until it died from neglect. Every complaint against human actions received immediate attention, immediate condemnation. It didn't matter that the Kresh had annexed 3 systems in the past year without a single rebuke. It didn't matter that the Trell trade cartels operated what amounted to slave markets on their outer colonies. It didn't matter that half the species in this hall had committed atrocities that made humanity's worst moments look like playground scuffles. What mattered was that humanity was new, young, unproven. And worst of all, humanity refused to accept its place at the bottom of the hierarchy. Thomas had spent the last decade of his life in council space. He'd negotiated treaties, mediated disputes, built relationships with dozens of species. He'd learned their customs, studied their histories, bent himself into shapes that left his soul aching just to prove that humans could be trusted, could be reasonable, could play by the rules. And for what? The Xanthari High Arbiter activated her podium's holographic display, projecting casualty figures from a border skirmish between human security forces and Vesk raiders. 12 Vesk vessels destroyed, she said, her voice carrying the harmonics that her species used to convey moral superiority. Hundreds of lives lost, and the human response? Claims of self-defense, refusal to submit to neutral arbitration. Thomas's jaw clenched. He'd read the full incident report, not the sanitized version the Vesk had submitted to the Council. Those raiders had attacked a human research station, killed 47 scientists, and were attempting to steal prototype terraforming equipment when the security forces arrived. The human ships had broadcast surrender demands in 6 languages before opening fire. They'd even recovered survivors afterward, provided them medical care, and returned them to Vesk space. None of that made it into the official record. "The Council must act," the Vesk ambassador said, spreading all 6 arms wide in a gesture of appeal. "We propose immediate sanctions, restriction of human access to the primary trade lanes, mandatory oversight of all human military operations, and suspension of Earth's petition for full Council membership until such time as they demonstrate genuine commitment to peaceful coexistence." The vote was a formality. Thomas watched the display boards light up with affirmative responses. Green after green after green, a cascade of condemnation that represented the united will of 216 species. Only one board remained dark. Earth's. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small data chip. He'd carried it for the past month, ever since he'd received the encrypted transmission from the Secretary General. He'd hoped he wouldn't need it. Right up until this moment, some part of him had clung to the belief that reason would prevail, that justice would emerge from the chaos. He was done hoping. Thomas activated his microphone. The sound of it powering up cut through the ambient noise of the assembly, and gradually the chamber fell silent. 216 species turned their attention to the human standing alone on the central platform. "I have a statement from the United Earth Government," Thomas said. His voice was steady, calm, professional. Inside, his heart hammered against his ribs. He inserted the data chip into the podium's reader. The Secretary General's words appeared on his display, but Thomas didn't need to read them. He'd memorized every line. "The United Earth Government acknowledges the Galactic Council's vote," he began. "We acknowledge your concerns, your fears, your judgment of our character, and our intentions." Thomas paused, letting the silence stretch. He could feel the weight of their attention now, the sudden shift in the atmosphere. They expected an apology, perhaps, a plea for reconsideration. That's what the younger species always did when faced with council judgment. They scrambled, they bargained, they debased themselves for scraps of approval. "We acknowledge that in the 37 years since first contact, we have failed to meet your expectations," Thomas continued. "We have been too independent, too assertive, too unwilling to simply accept the existing order without question. For this, you have judged us dangerous, aggressive, unworthy." The Vesk ambassador's mandibles clicked in what might have been satisfaction. The Trell representative's crystalline body seemed to pulse with pleased light. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd put the upstart humans in their place. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest, pushing out the bitterness, the frustration, the anger. What remained was clarity. "Therefore," he said, "effective immediately, the United Earth Government is withdrawing from all Galactic Council activities. We are terminating our observer status, ceasing all diplomatic relations, and recalling every human citizen from Council space." The silence that followed was absolute. For 3 heartbeats, the vast assembly hall might have been airless, lifeless, a tomb rather than a seat of galactic governance. Then the chaos erupted. The Trell representative was on her feet, light fracturing wildly from her body. "You cannot simply walk away. There are protocols, procedures, which you've used to strangle every initiative we've proposed," Thomas said. His voice never rose, never wavered. "We've followed your protocols for 37 years. We've been patient. We've been accommodating. We're done." The Xanthari High Arbiter's harmonics took on an edge of panic. "This is unprecedented. No species has ever voluntarily withdrawn from Council space." "Then we're the first." Thomas looked around the chamber, meeting eyes and optical sensors and sensory organs he couldn't begin to name. "We came to you in good faith. We offered our knowledge, our resources, our friendship. We asked only to be treated as equals. Instead, you've spent nearly 4 decades treating us like dangerous children who need to be controlled, contained, and corrected." The dressy trade minister, a being whose species had maintained profitable relationships with human corporations, activated his microphone. "Ambassador Garrett, please, if we could discuss this reasonably." "Reasonably?" Thomas felt a laugh building in his throat, bitter and hard. He swallowed it down. "We've been reasonable. We've absorbed your insults, accepted your double standards, watched you apply rules to us that you ignore when it comes to your own members. The Kesh annexed 3 inhabited systems last year. Where were the sanctions? Where was the mandatory oversight?" The Kesh delegate remained silent, his massive form coiled in his chamber. He was smart enough not to draw attention. "The Vortan Confederacy has been conducting biological weapons research in violation of 37 different council regulations," Thomas continued. "We provided evidence. Testimony from defectors, intercepted communications. Your response was to form an investigative committee that has been studying the matter for 6 years. The Vortan representative's translator began to emit protests, but Thomas spoke over them. "But when human security forces defend a research station against raiders who murdered 47 unarmed scientists, you vote for sanctions within 6 hours." Thomas pulled the data chip from the podium reader. "We're not interested in playing a game where the rules change depending on who's breaking them." He turned to leave, then stopped. There was more to say, more that needed to be said. Not for them. They wouldn't understand, wouldn't want to understand. But for the record, for history. "You've made assumptions about humanity based on fear," Thomas said, turning back to face the assembly. "You see our military strength and assume we're warlike. You see our economic success and assume we're exploitative. You see our refusal to accept second-class status and assume we're arrogant." He paused. "You're wrong. But you'll never believe that, because you've already decided who we are." The Vesk ambassador found his voice. "You prove our point. This tantrum, this childish response to legitimate oversight." "There's nothing legitimate about what you've done here," Thomas said. The coldness in his chest had spread through his entire body now. He felt distant from himself, as if he were watching this scene unfold from somewhere far away. "You've constructed a system designed to maintain your positions at the top of the hierarchy. New species aren't invited to join you as equals. They're added to the bottom of the pyramid to be exploited and controlled." He'd seen it clearly over the years, once he'd known what to look for. The way the older species controlled access to key technologies, doling out advancement like treats to performing animals. The way council protocols ensured that any challenge to established power could be tied up in bureaucracy for decades. The way species that grew too powerful, too independent, suddenly found themselves facing exactly the kind of scrutiny humanity had endured. "We won't be part of it," Thomas said simply. "We're going home." The dressy minister tried again, his voice desperate. "Ambassador, think about what you're doing. The economic consequences alone have been accounted for." Thomas had spent the last month working with economists and strategists, modeling exactly what withdrawal would mean. It wouldn't be painless. Earth's economy would take a hit. Companies that had invested heavily in council trade would face losses. But humanity had survived worse. They'd adapt. More importantly, they'd be free. Human corporations control 42% of the quantum drive component market, the dressy continued. 78% of advanced medical nanotechnology, 39% of all of which will no longer be available to Council species, Thomas said. Existing contracts will be honored but not renewed. No new trade agreements will be negotiated. No technology transfers will occur. No joint ventures will be approved. He let that sink in. You wanted us to walk away. Congratulations. The Trell representative's voice was sharp now, the light from her body turning harsh and red. You'll cripple yourselves. Human colonies throughout Council space are being evacuated as we speak, Thomas said. Every human citizen, every human corporation, every human presence in Council space is withdrawing. We're not leaving hostages to your judgment. It had been a massive undertaking. 347 colonies, research stations, trading posts, and diplomatic missions. 2 million humans living and working throughout Council space. The logistics alone had required 6 months of secret planning. The Secretary General had authorized the preparations the moment it became clear that the Council would never grant humanity equal status. Thomas had argued against it at first. He'd been so sure that persistence would pay off, that eventually the evidence of human goodwill would overcome their prejudice. He'd been naive. The Secretary General had seen the truth months before he had. The Council didn't want humanity to succeed. They wanted humanity to submit. The evacuation began 60 days ago, Thomas said. It will be complete in another 30. After that, we would appreciate it if you considered all space within 10 light years of any human-controlled system to be restricted. Any Council vessel that enters that space will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. The Xanthari High Arbiter's harmonics reached a pitch that made Thomas's teeth ache. You're threatening us? We're establishing boundaries, Thomas corrected. Something the Council seems to understand when your member species do it, but considers aggressive when we do the same. He picked up his briefcase from beside the podium. We're not interested in conquest. We're not interested in domination. We're not even interested in revenge, though we'd be justified. He started walking toward the exit. His footsteps echoed in the vast chamber, lonely and final. We're simply done trying to convince you that we're worthy of respect, Thomas called back over his shoulder. You've made your judgment. We've made ours. The Vesk ambassador's voice followed him. You'll regret this. You're isolating yourselves, cutting yourselves off from the rest of the galaxy. Thomas stopped at the threshold of the exit. He didn't turn around. We're not isolating ourselves, he said quietly. We're leaving a club that never wanted us as members in the first place. There's a difference. Then he walked out, and the great doors of the Council Assembly Hall closed behind him with a sound like thunder. The corridor outside was empty. Thomas had ordered his entire staff to return to the embassy 6 hours ago, to begin final preparations for departure. He walked alone through passages that had once seemed grand and inspiring. Now they just felt hollow. His communicator buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and saw a message from his second-in-command at the embassy. All personnel accounted for. Ready for departure on your order. Thomas typed back, Begin final protocols. We leave at dawn. Another message came through, this one from the Secretary General herself. Just 2 words. Well done. Thomas slid the communicator back into his pocket. He didn't feel like he'd done well. He felt like he'd failed, like he'd spent a decade of his life on a mission that had been doomed from the start. But maybe that was the point. Maybe sometimes you had to fail at the wrong thing before you could succeed at the right thing. The right thing, he was beginning to understand, wasn't convincing the Council to accept humanity. The right thing was building something better. Something that didn't require lesser species to prostrate themselves for approval. He emerged from the Council complex into artificial evening. The capital city of the Galactic Council sprawled around him, a monument to 60,000 years of cooperative civilization. Towers reached into the sky, transit systems hummed with efficient traffic. Beings from 200 worlds moved through carefully designed spaces, each zone accommodated to different environmental needs. It was magnificent, and humanity would walk away from all of it without looking back. Thomas smiled. It wasn't a happy expression. The human embassy was a modest structure compared to the towering spires that housed the delegations of older species. 3 stories of simple geometric lines, constructed from Earth materials that had been shipped across half the galaxy at enormous expense. Thomas had always appreciated its understated dignity, the way it refused to compete with the architectural excess that surrounded it. Tonight, it looked like exactly what it was, a temporary presence that had never truly belonged. Thomas found his deputy, Rebecca Martinez, in the communications center. She was coordinating the final data purges, ensuring that no sensitive information would fall into council hands after their departure. Rebecca was 38, sharp-featured, with the kind of intense focus that made her invaluable in crisis situations. She'd been his anchor through the worst moments of the past few years, the voice of reason when his frustration threatened to overwhelm his judgment. "How did they take it?" she asked without looking up from her screens. "About as well as you'd expect." Thomas loosened his tie, suddenly feeling the weight of the formal diplomatic uniform. The Vesk called it a tantrum. The Trell are probably calculating their losses already. The Xanthari seemed genuinely shocked that we'd actually walk away. Rebecca's fingers paused over her keyboard. "Any last-minute offers? Promises of reform?" Thomas laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "They're still convinced this is a negotiating tactic. They think we'll come crawling back once we realize what we're giving up." He moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. "They don't understand that we've already realized what we're giving up. And we've decided it isn't worth what we'd have to sacrifice to keep it." The evacuation reports scrolled across Rebecca's main display. Green lights marked completed withdrawals. Yellow indicated operations in progress. Only a handful of red markers remained, colonies in distant sectors where the logistics were particularly challenging. "The Centauri mining operation finished their pullout this morning," Rebecca said. 43 years of development, and they just walked away from it, left the whole infrastructure intact. Thomas nodded. He'd reviewed that decision personally. The Centauri operation had been one of humanity's most profitable ventures in council space, extracting rare minerals that were essential for quantum drive construction. The evacuation meant abandoning not just the mines themselves, but the orbital processing stations, the transport networks, the entire supply chain that had taken decades to build. The economic impact would be significant, but there were principles worth more than profit. "Any word from the research stations?" Thomas asked. Dr. Singh's team on Kepler Station finished their shutdown 6 hours ago. They managed to pack most of the critical data, but they had to leave the particle accelerator. Rebecca's voice carried a note of regret. 20 years of xenobiology research, just abandoned. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. The Kepler Station research had been humanity's most significant contribution to galactic science, groundbreaking work on cellular regeneration that had saved millions of lives across dozens of species. The team had been on the verge of major breakthroughs, discoveries that could revolutionize medicine throughout the Council. Now that work would die with their departure. They made their choice, Thomas said quietly. They decided that controlling us was more important than what we could contribute. Let them live with the consequences. Rebecca pulled up another screen, this one showing communication intercepts from Council space. Our intelligence assets are reporting interesting reactions. The Dressy Trade Federation is in emergency session. 3 major contracts with human corporations were supposed to be renewed next month. Thomas wasn't surprised. The Dressi had been one of the few species willing to treat humans as genuine partners rather than junior associates. Their trade relationships had been mutually beneficial, built on respect rather than exploitation. They would suffer from humanity's withdrawal, but they'd also voted for sanctions. The hegemony is mobilizing military assets, Rebecca continued. Looks like they're planning to occupy some of the territory we're abandoning. The hegemony. Thomas felt his jaw clench. They were one of the Council's founding species, ancient and powerful, with a military that dwarfed most others. They'd been among humanity's harshest critics, constantly warning about human expansionism while quietly absorbing system after system into their own territory. Let them, Thomas said. Those systems were never really ours anyway. We were just caretakers, managing them under council authority. If the hegemony wants to deal with the bureaucracy and oversight required to formally claim them, they're welcome to try. Rebecca's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Some of those colonies have been human for 30 years. People built lives there, raised families. And now they're coming home, Thomas interrupted, to systems where they'll be citizens, not subjects, where their children can grow up free from the need to constantly prove they deserve to exist. He'd seen it too often over the years, the way human colonists in council space had to navigate a maze of restrictions and regulations that never seemed to apply equally to other species. Human children growing up knowing they were second-class citizens in their own homes, watching their parents defer to alien authorities not out of respect, but out of necessity. No more. The transport fleets are performing above expectations, Rebecca said, switching to another display. Admiral Chen estimates we'll have everyone home 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Admiral Lisa Chen commanded the evacuation fleet, a collection of military and civilian vessels that represented the largest peacetime logistics operation in human history. She'd spent months planning routes, calculating cargo capacities, coordinating with colonial authorities across hundreds of worlds. It was a masterpiece of organizational efficiency. It was also a demonstration of human capability that wouldn't be lost on council observers. The Vesk are calling it a retreat, Rebecca said. Their propaganda channels are playing it as proof of human cowardice. Thomas almost smiled. Let them. By the time they realize what we actually accomplished, it'll be too late for their propaganda to matter. The evacuation wasn't just a withdrawal, it was a proof of concept. Humanity had moved 2 million people and countless tons of equipment across interstellar distances in less than 3 months, all while maintaining operational security that had prevented the Council from anticipating or interfering with the operation. No other species in Council history had demonstrated that kind of logistical capability. The implications would become clear soon enough. Thomas's communicator chimed. An encrypted message from Earth, highest priority classification. He opened it and read quickly, then read it again more slowly. "What is it?" Rebecca asked. "New intelligence from our assets in Council space," Thomas said. Apparently, the Trell are planning to seize human assets that can't be evacuated in time. They're calling it abandonment salvage, under some obscure council regulation. Rebecca's expression darkened. Which assets? Thomas consulted the message. The orbital shipyard at Vega 7, the manufacturing complex on Delta Pavonis, the research facility at Wolf 359. He looked up. All told, about 40 billion credits worth of infrastructure. Can we stop them? Thomas considered. The assets in question were massive, fixed installations that couldn't be moved in the time remaining. They represented decades of human investment, technological advances that had taken years to develop. Under normal circumstances, losing them would be catastrophic. But these weren't normal circumstances. No, Thomas said finally. And we're not going to try. Rebecca stared at him. Tom, Those facilities represent— I know what they represent. Thomas moved to his desk, pulling up classified files that only a handful of humans had access to. I also know what the Council doesn't. The files contained technical specifications, engineering reports, and classified memoranda that painted a very different picture of human activities in Council space than what had been presented to the public. Rebecca's eyes widened as she scanned the documents. Self-destruct systems? She said quietly. Installed in every major facility over the past 5 years, Thomas confirmed. The Secretary General wasn't taking any chances. If we couldn't take our technology with us, we weren't going to leave it behind for others to reverse engineer. The implications were staggering. Every major human installation in Council space was rigged with quantum demolition charges, sophisticated systems designed to completely vaporize any technology that might be useful to potential enemies. The Council thought they were seizing valuable assets. Instead, they would find empty shells filled with radioactive vapor. When do we activate them? Rebecca asked. Thomas checked his chronometer. 12 hours after the last human citizen clears Council space. That should give the Trell just enough time to move their salvage teams into position. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what they were planning. This is going to send a message, she said finally. That's the idea. Thomas closed the classified files. The Council seems to think we're children who can be bullied into submission. It's time they learned otherwise. The evacuation hadn't been a retreat. It had been a strategic withdrawal, carefully planned and precisely executed. And the destruction of the abandoned facilities wouldn't be sabotage or spite. It would be a demonstration of human capabilities, a warning about what happened when you underestimated Earth. The Council wanted to treat humanity as a minor species that could be safely ignored or controlled. They were about to discover their mistake, because humans didn't just walk away quietly, they walked away with purpose. And when they were gone, they made sure no one could follow them home. Thomas's communicator chimed again. Another message from Admiral Chen. Final transport departing Vega 7 in 6 hours. All personnel accounted for. Ready to light the fuse on your order. Thomas typed back, confirmed. Burn it all. The Council had made their choice. Now they would live with the consequences. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks. Thomas spent most of it in his quarters aboard the diplomatic transport, reviewing reports and preparing briefings for the inevitable questions he'd face once he arrived home. The ship was crowded with evacuees from the embassy and surrounding human facilities, people whose lives had been upended by decisions made in distant halls of power. He saw the uncertainty in their faces, the worry about what came next. But he also saw something else. Relief. The kind of bone-deep relief that came from no longer having to pretend, to defer, to constantly justify your existence to people who had already decided you weren't worthy. Earth appeared in the viewport on a Tuesday morning. Ship time. Thomas had seen it countless times from orbit, but it never failed to move him. Blue and white and achingly beautiful, hanging in the void like a promise, like home. The debriefing sessions started before his shuttle even touched down at the diplomatic complex in Geneva. Secretary General Patricia Okoye was waiting in the conference room, along with the Joint Chiefs, the intelligence directors, and half a dozen other officials whose faces Thomas recognized from classified briefings. Patricia was 64, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. She'd been the driving force behind the withdrawal, the one who'd seen clearly what the Council truly was when others still clung to false hope. "Ambassador Garrett," she said, standing to shake his hand. "Welcome home." "Madam Secretary." Thomas took his seat at the conference table. "I assume you've reviewed my preliminary reports?" Multiple times. Patricia activated the holographic display in the center of the table. The Council's response has been interesting. The display showed news feeds from across Council space. The Vesk propaganda channels were still crowing about human cowardice, but there were cracks in the narrative. The dressy economic forums were filled with panic about supply chain disruptions. The Trell trade networks were scrambling to replace human manufacturing capacity. And the hegemony military dispatches showed something Thomas found particularly satisfying: confusion. "They didn't expect us to actually leave," General Raymond Hayes said. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. A career military man who'd spent the last decade preparing for a war he hoped would never come. "They thought it was a bluff. They spent 40 years treating us like we had nowhere else to go," Thomas said. "They genuinely believed we needed them more than they needed us." Patricia pulled up another display, this one showing the aftermath of the facility destructions. The orbital shipyard at Vega 7 was now an expanding cloud of molecular debris. The manufacturing complex on Delta Pavonis had vaporized so completely that Council investigators couldn't even determine what had been inside. The research facility at Wolf 359 had left a radiation signature visible from 3 star systems away. "The Trell are demanding reparations," Patricia said. "They claim we violated Council property laws by destroying facilities in their territorial space." Thomas felt a cold smile cross his face. "Those facilities were on leased land. The leases expired the moment we withdrew from Council space. What we did with our own property is none of their concern." "They're also claiming the destructions were acts of terrorism," added Director Sarah Chen from Intelligence. "They're pushing for a Council resolution condemning Earth for hostile actions." "Let them push." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "We're not Council members anymore. Their resolutions don't mean anything to us." The hegemony military officer, Admiral Kowalski, spoke up. "They're testing our borders. We've had 17 incursions in the past week. All in supposedly neutral space within the 10 light-year buffer zone we declared." "Response protocol?" Thomas asked. "We broadcast warnings in standard, give them 30 seconds to reverse course, then we fire across their bow. If they persist, we disable their drives and send them drifting back where they came from." Kowalski's expression was grim. "So far, none of them have pushed past the warning shots. But they're testing us, seeing how serious we are about enforcing the buffer." Thomas understood the game. The Council was trying to establish that humanity's withdrawal didn't give them the right to dictate terms, that the old power structures still applied. They were wrong, but they wouldn't accept that until they were forced to. "Any military buildups near our borders?" he asked. "Nothing significant," Kowalski replied. "The Vesk have moved 3 battle groups into adjacent sectors, but that's more for show than genuine threat. The hegemony has increased their patrol frequency, but again, it looks like posturing rather than preparation for actual conflict." Patricia dismissed the military displays and brought up economic data. "The impact on our economy has been substantial but manageable. We've lost approximately 12% of our interstellar trade volume, but domestic markets are compensating faster than projected. Several major corporations are reporting record profits from redirected production." Thomas wasn't surprised. Human ingenuity had always been adaptable. Cut off from Council markets, Earth's corporations were finding new opportunities, developing products for human consumption. Innovating without the need to conform to Council standards and regulations. "What about the colonies?" he asked. "How are they adjusting?" Director of Colonial Affairs. Marcus Webb pulled up a star chart showing the 143 systems under human control. "Better than expected. The colonies that were in Council space are being resettled to systems within our core territories. We've had some growing pains with infrastructure and resource allocation, but nothing we can't handle. Most colonists are just grateful to be somewhere they're actually wanted," Thomas had worried about that aspect of the withdrawal more than almost anything else. Uprooting 2 million people, forcing them to abandon homes they'd built over decades, risked creating resentment that could poison public opinion against the entire strategy. But the reports suggested otherwise. People understood. They'd lived under council jurisdiction long enough to know what they were escaping from. Public sentiment? Patricia asked, directing the question to the Director of Public Affairs. Running 73% in favor of the withdrawal, came the response. The remaining 27% are split between those who think we should have stayed and negotiated, and those who think we should have been more aggressive on our way out. Overall, the population seems relieved that we're no longer trying to appease the council. Patricia nodded slowly, absorbing the information. Ambassador Garrett, you've spent the last decade dealing directly with council species. In your professional opinion, what happens next? Thomas considered the question carefully. He'd been thinking about it since the moment he'd walked out of the council assembly hall, turning over possibilities and probabilities in his mind. Short term, they'll continue testing us, he said finally. Border incursions, economic pressure, propaganda campaigns. They'll try to demonstrate that humanity's withdrawal was a mistake, that we're isolating ourselves into irrelevance. They need that narrative to prevent other species from following our example. And long term? Patricia pressed. Thomas met her eyes. Long term, they're going to realize they made a critical miscalculation. The council exists to maintain the power of its oldest, strongest members. They've spent 60,000 years perfecting a system that keeps everyone else dependent on them. But humanity doesn't fit that model. We're too independent, too innovative, too unwilling to accept subordinate status. He stood, moving to the holographic display and manipulating it to show human-controlled space. We control 143 systems now. Our population is growing faster than any species in council space. Our technology is advancing at rates that make them nervous, and now we're no longer constrained by their regulations, their oversight, their constant attempts to limit our growth. Thomas zoomed the display out, showing council space in relation to human territory. They wanted us gone because they thought we were dangerous. They were right about the dangerous part. They were just wrong about why. Patricia's expression was unreadable. You think they'll come for us eventually. I think they'll realize that leaving us alone to develop without their interference was the worst possible outcome from their perspective, Thomas said. Give us 50 years, and we'll match their military capability. Give us 100, and we'll surpass them. They're not going to wait that long. The room fell silent. Everyone present understood the implications. The withdrawal hadn't solved the fundamental problem. It had merely changed the nature of the conflict. So we prepare, Patricia said finally. We build. We fortify. We make sure that when they come, they understand exactly what it costs to threaten humanity. Thomas nodded. And we make sure the rest of the galaxy knows there are alternatives to council membership. There are younger species out there, trapped in the same system we escaped from. When they're ready to walk away, we'll be there. 18 months after the withdrawal, Thomas found himself back in space, but this time on humanity's terms. The diplomatic vessel cut through the void toward a neutral meeting point, a barren system that belonged to no one, claimed by no government, recognized by no treaty. The coordinates had been transmitted through encrypted channels by an intermediary who refused to identify themselves, along with a simple message. Representatives of 6 species wanted to talk. Thomas stood on the bridge, watching the tactical display. Admiral Chen was at the helm, her expression tight with the kind of controlled tension that came from expecting trouble. They'd brought an escort, 3 frigates running dark at the edge of sensor range. The Secretary General had insisted. If this was a trap, humanity wouldn't walk into it blindly. Contact on approach vector, the sensor officer called out. 6 vessels, matching the expected profiles. Dressy, Kalesh, Nim, Torvan, Zien, and one unidentified. Thomas felt something shift in his chest. The Dressi he'd expected. They'd been sending back-channel communications for months, carefully worded inquiries about whether humanity might consider limited trade resumption. But the others were surprises. The Kesh were insectoid, a hive species that had joined the Council 60 years ago and had been systematically stripped of their autonomy ever since. The Nim were aquatic, brilliant engineers whose innovations were routinely claimed by older species under Council intellectual property laws. The Torvane he knew less about, a reptilian race that kept to themselves. The Gen, though. The Gen were interesting. They'd been council members for 2,000 years, long enough to have climbed several rungs up the hierarchy. They weren't at the top, would never be permitted at the top, but they had enough power to be comfortable. If they were here, it meant something significant. "They're requesting permission to dock," the communications officer said. Thomas glanced at Admiral Chen. She nodded slightly. "Granted. But keep our weapons hot." The docking procedures took 20 minutes. Thomas used the time to review what intelligence had gathered about each species represented. The patterns were telling. Every one of them had been on the receiving end of Council exploitation in various forms. The Dressi with their trade restrictions, the Kesh with their political subordination, the Nim with their stolen innovations. Even the Gen, despite their relative power, operated under constraints that limited their autonomy. The conference room was deliberately sparse. Thomas had ordered it that way. No grand gestures, no theatrical displays of wealth or power. Just a table, chairs adjusted for various physiologies, and the truth. The representatives filed in. The Dressi delegation was led by Minister Kelvin, whose complex olfactory organs twitched with what Thomas had learned to recognize as anxiety. The Kesh sent their sub-queen, Tresk, a rare honor that suggested how seriously they took this meeting. The Nim representative was Dr. Ven, one of their most renowned engineers. The Torvane sent Ambassador Srek, a scarred veteran whose translator relayed words with careful precision. The Gen delegation was led by High Coordinator Vess, whose black eyes revealed nothing. The unidentified vessel had sent no representative. It simply remained docked, silent and observing. "Thank you for coming," Thomas began. He remained standing, a deliberate choice that put him at eye level with most of the delegates. "I'll be direct. Why are you here?" Minister Kelvin's olfactory organs fluttered. "Because we watched what humanity did. Not just the withdrawal, but what came after." He activated a small holographic projector, displaying economic data. Council trade networks are destabilizing. Human quantum drive components were integral to 70% of interstellar commerce. The Trell tried to reverse engineer your technology from the facilities you destroyed. They failed. Production has dropped by 43%, and costs have tripled. "Our medical supply chains have collapsed," Dr. Ven added, her translated voice carrying an edge of desperation. "Human nanomedical technology saved 14 billion lives last year across Council space. Now it's gone. We've had to revert to treatments that are decades less effective. Mortality rates are climbing." Thomas kept his expression neutral, but inside he felt a grim satisfaction. The Council had spent 40 years taking humanity's contributions for granted, assuming they could access human innovation whenever convenient, while simultaneously restricting human influence. Now, they were learning the cost of that arrogance. "The Council is fracturing," High Coordinator Vess said. His voice was calm, analytical. "Not visibly, not yet, but the economic strain is creating pressure. Species that benefited from human presence are questioning why the Council drove you away. The older powers are scrambling to maintain control, but they're discovering that fear and force aren't sufficient when their subjects are watching alternatives." What alternatives? Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. Ambassador Shrek leaned forward. You, humanity. You walked away from the Council and you thrived. Your economy is growing faster than any Council member. Your technology continues advancing without Council oversight. Your people are free. His translator captured what might have been longing in his natural voice. You proved it was possible. Thomas sat down slowly, letting the moment extend. This was what the Secretary General had predicted, what they'd hoped for but hadn't dared assume. The withdrawal hadn't isolated humanity. It had created a beacon. So you want to withdraw as well, Thomas said. We want to explore options, Minister Kelvin corrected quickly. The Council has been the only galactic governance structure for 60,000 years. Walking away from it is significant. It's terrifying, Dr. Venn said bluntly. Our species have been part of the Council for generations. Our economies are integrated with theirs. Our security depends on Council protection. The idea of simply leaving— You're not asking how to leave, Thomas interrupted. You're asking if it's possible to survive after leaving. The silence that followed confirmed his assessment. Thomas stood again, moving to the viewport that showed the curve of the nearby planet. 18 months ago, we controlled 143 systems with a combined population of 8 billion. We had a functional economy but were constrained by Council regulations at every turn. Our military was strong but focused on defense, because Council protocols limited offensive capability development. Our technology was advanced but controlled because the Council determined what we could research and what we had to share. He turned back to face them. Today, we control 151 systems with a population of 8.4 billion and climbing. Our economy has grown by 22%. Our military has commissioned 18 new battle groups with capabilities the Council can't match because we're no longer restricted by their oversight. And our technology? Thomas smiled. We've made advances in the last year that we couldn't have achieved in a decade under Council rules. But you're isolated, High Coordinator Vess pointed out. Cut off from galactic commerce and cooperation. We're independent, Thomas corrected. There's a difference. We trade with species willing to treat us as equals. We cooperate with those who respect our sovereignty. We defend ourselves against those who don't. And we're discovering that freedom is worth more than access to markets that only ever valued us as subordinates. Sub-Queen Tresk's mandibles clicked in a pattern Thomas's translator rendered as uncertainty. The Council will not simply allow mass exodus. If multiple species attempt withdrawal, they will respond with force. Probably, Thomas agreed. Which is why you don't do it the way we did. We had the luxury of being strong enough to defend ourselves and far enough from Council Corps territories to make military response costly. Most of you don't have those advantages. Then what do you suggest? Minister Kelvin asked. Thomas had thought about this question for months, ever since the first back-channel inquiries had started arriving. The answer wasn't simple, but it was clear. You build leverage, he said. You form economic alliances with each other independent of Council oversight. You develop military cooperation agreements that don't require Council approval. You create parallel structures that make you less dependent on Council systems. And when you're ready, when you're strong enough that they can't easily crush you, then you walk away. That could take decades, Dr. Venn said. It will take decades, Thomas confirmed. Freedom isn't something you achieve in a day. It's something you build, piece by piece, until you're strong enough to claim it and defend it. High Coordinator Vess studied Thomas with those unreadable black eyes. And humanity? What role do you play in this? Thomas had anticipated this question too. We offer an alternative. Trade agreements that don't require you to surrender your sovereignty. Technology sharing that's mutual rather than one-sided. Security cooperation that respects your independence. We're not trying to replace the Council with human hegemony. We're demonstrating that galactic civilization doesn't require subordination. You're building an alliance, Ambassador Shrek said. We're building a partnership, Thomas corrected. Between equals, no hierarchy, no exploitation, no species subordinated to others. Just mutual cooperation based on mutual respect. The representatives exchanged glances, complex communications happening through body language and subtle signals that Thomas couldn't fully interpret. He'd laid out the vision. Now they had to decide if they believed it was possible. We would need guarantees, Minister Kelvin said finally. Protection during the transition period, economic support, military assistance if the Council responds aggressively. We can discuss terms, Thomas said. But understand, this isn't about humanity protecting you. It's about us standing together. If you want to be free, you have to be willing to defend that freedom. 5 years after the withdrawal, Thomas stood in a command center deep beneath Geneva, watching a crisis unfold in real time. The walls were lined with displays showing star charts, fleet positions, communication intercepts, and tactical analyses. 20 officers worked at stations throughout the room, their voices calm despite the tension that crackled through the air like static electricity. The Kalesh had made their move. Sub-Queen Tresk had spent the past 4 years following Thomas's advice. She'd built economic alliances with the Nim, the Dressy, and a dozen other species chafing under Council control. She'd negotiated military cooperation agreements that created mutual defense obligations. She'd systematically reduced her species' dependence on Council systems until the hive worlds could function independently. And 3 days ago, she'd announced the Kalesh Confederacy's withdrawal from the Galactic Council. The response had been immediate and brutal. The Vesk had moved 4 battle groups toward Kalesh space within hours. The hegemony had activated their reserve fleets. The Council had passed an emergency resolution declaring the Kalesh withdrawal illegal and authorizing military action to enforce compliance. They were calling it a police action. Thomas called it what it was: a war to terrorize any species considering independence. Vesk lead elements will reach the Kalesh border in 6 hours, Admiral Chen reported from her station. She'd been promoted to overall military command 2 years ago, her strategic brilliance recognized after she'd successfully repelled 3 Council probing attacks on human space. The hegemony fleet is 12 hours behind them. Secretary General Okoye stood beside Thomas, her expression carved from stone. Status of our own forces? 5th and 7th fleets are positioned at the coordinates we discussed, Admiral Chen replied. Another 18 hours to reach Kalesh space if we give the order. 3rd Fleet is holding at our border as reserve. The Dressy have mobilized their defensive forces, and the Nim are scrambling their engineering squadrons. Thomas studied the tactical display. The mathematics were brutal. The Kalesh military was respectable, but not powerful enough to stand against combined Vesk and hegemony forces. They'd fight, they'd inflict casualties, but they'd ultimately be crushed. Then the Council would make an example of them, occupying their worlds and installing a puppet government to demonstrate what happened to species that defied the established order. Unless someone intervened. Communications from the Kalesh government, an officer called out. Sub-Queen Tresk is requesting emergency consultation. Put her through, Patricia said. The main display shifted to show Tresk's image. Her compound eyes reflected the harsh lighting of what looked like a military command center. Behind her, Thomas could see other Kalesh moving with the coordinated efficiency of a hive species under threat. Secretary General Okoye, Ambassador Garrett, Tresk said. Her translator rendered her voice with an edge of something that might have been fear or anger or both. The Council fleets are approaching our territory. They're broadcasting demands for our unconditional surrender and reintegration into Council authority. What's your military assessment? Patricia asked. We can hold them for perhaps 3 standard days if we fully commit our forces, Tresk replied. But the cost will be catastrophic. We're projecting 70% casualties across our defensive fleets, and even if we somehow repel the first wave, they'll send more. The Council has made it clear this is about more than just the Kalesh. This is a message to every species watching. Thomas knew what she was really asking. They'd spent 4 years building relationships, signing agreements, making promises about mutual support and collective security. Now the Kalesh were facing annihilation, and they wanted to know if those promises meant anything. Patricia looked at Thomas. Your recommendation? Thomas had been awake for 36 hours, running simulations and consulting with military strategists and political advisors. The decision came down to a simple calculation. Was humanity willing to go to war with the Council to defend the principle of independence? He thought about the past decade, the years of humiliation in council chambers, watching his species be treated as dangerous children. The withdrawal, walking away from everything they'd built because staying meant accepting subordination. The 18 months of isolation, proving that humanity could thrive without council approval. The careful cultivation of alliances with species who wanted something better. All of it led to this moment. We honor our commitments, Thomas said. We deployed 5th and 7th fleets. We make it clear that an attack on the Kalesh is an attack on humanity's allies, and we defend our allies. Patricia held his gaze for a long moment. Thomas knew what she was weighing. Human casualties, economic disruption, the risk of a wider war that could engulf the entire sector. Against that, the principle that species had the right to choose their own governance without being crushed by greater powers. Admiral Chen, Patricia said, never looking away from Thomas. Execute Deployment Order 7. Our fleets are authorized to enter Kalesh space and take defensive positions. Any Council forces that engage the Kalesh will be considered hostile to human interests. Acknowledged, Admiral Chen said. Thomas heard the satisfaction in her voice. The military had been itching for this, for the chance to demonstrate that humanity wasn't just defensively capable, but willing to project power in defense of their principles. Sub-Queen Tresk, Patricia continued, turning back to the display. Human forces will arrive in your space within 18 hours. Until then, your defensive forces should maintain position, but avoid offensive action. We don't want to give the Council any excuse to claim you fired first. Tresk's compound eyes seemed to glitter. Secretary General, this will mean war with the Council. Humanity has prospered in these years of peace. Are you certain? There's no peace in a galaxy where the strong crush, the weak for daring to be free. Patricia interrupted. We're certain. The transmission ended. Thomas felt the weight of what they'd just committed to settling over the room like a physical presence. In 18 hours, human warships would face Council forces in direct combat for the first time. Everything that came after would depend on what happened in that confrontation. Get me the Dressy Trade Minister, Thomas said to the communications officer, and Dr. Venn from the NIM Engineering Consortium. If we're doing this, we need to make sure everyone who signed mutual defense agreements understands we're invoking them. The next 6 hours were a blur of diplomatic communications. The Dressy agreed to position their forces to threaten Vesk supply lines. The NIM committed their engineering squadrons to provide technical support for the Kalesh defensive installations. The Torvain, still nominally Council members, quietly recalled their ships from joint Council operations and moved them to defensive positions around their home systems. The Gen were the surprise. High Coordinator Vess appeared on Thomas's personal channel, his expression as unreadable as ever. Ambassador Garrett, Vess said, the Gen Concordat has been evaluating our position within the Council structure for some time. Your intervention on behalf of the Kalesh has crystallized our thinking. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Coordinator? We are announcing our withdrawal from the Galactic Council effective immediately, Vess said. Furthermore, We are committing 3rd and 8th Gen fleets to defensive operations in Kalesh space. The Council should understand that their era of unopposed dominance is ending. Thomas had to sit down. The Gen weren't just another minor species chafing under Council control. They were a middle power with significant military capability and economic influence. Their withdrawal was a hammer blow to Council authority. The Council will respond aggressively, Thomas warned. You'll face the same threats the Kalesh are facing. Which is why we're not withdrawing alone, Vess replied. We've been in communication with 17 other species. Not all are prepared to leave immediately, but enough are ready that the Council will face multiple crises simultaneously. They can't crush us all at once. It was the strategy Thomas had outlined 5 years ago, but seeing it actually implemented was staggering. The Galactic Council had endured for 60,000 years, an institution so entrenched that most species couldn't imagine existence outside its structure. Now it was fracturing, and humanity was at the center of the fracture. Coordinator, if you're committed to this path, we should coordinate our deployments, Thomas said, his mind already racing through tactical implications. Combined human and Gen forces would present a deterrent the Council can't easily overcome. Agreed, Vess said. I'm transmitting our fleet dispositions now. I suggest we establish a joint command structure. Thomas looked at Patricia, who nodded. We'll have our military liaison contact yours within the hour, Thomas said. The transmission ended. The command center had gone silent, every officer having stopped to listen to the exchange. Well, Patricia said quietly, we wanted to demonstrate that there were alternatives to Council authority. I think we've succeeded. Thomas moved back to the tactical display. 17 species considering withdrawal. The Gen already committed. The Dressi, Nim, and Torvin mobilizing in support of the Kalesh. And at the center of it all, human fleets moving to enforce the principle that freedom was worth defending. The Council would call it rebellion. History would call it revolution. Thomas called it overdue. The Battle of Kesh Prime lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. Thomas watched it unfold from the command center, every sensor feed and tactical report streaming in with crystalline clarity. The Vesk battle groups had arrived first, arrogant in their assumed superiority, broadcasting demands for Kalesh surrender even as they moved into attack formation. They hadn't expected to find human warships waiting. The 5th Fleet, under the command of Rear Admiral Vincent Torres, had positioned itself in a defensive sphere around the Kalesh home system. When the Vesk commander demanded they withdraw or face destruction, Torres had responded with a single transmission. Fire if you dare. The Vesk had dared. The opening salvo lit up the tactical display like a constellation being born. Vesk plasma cannons, weapons that had dominated Council warfare for centuries, lashed out at human positions. The human shields absorbed the impacts, energy dispersal systems spreading the damage across overlapping defensive grids. Then the human ships returned fire. Railgun rounds moving at relativistic speeds tore through Vesk armor like it was paper. Missile swarms overwhelmed their point defense systems. And the new quantum disruptor technology that humanity had developed in isolation punched holes in Vesk shields that should have been impenetrable. Within 90 minutes, the Vesk had lost half their battle group. The Vesk commander is requesting terms, Admiral Chen reported, her voice carrying a note of fierce satisfaction. He's attempting to negotiate a ceasefire. Denied, Patricia said immediately. They came here to crush a species for daring to be free. They don't get to quit when they discover it's harder than expected. Thomas watched the Vesk fleet attempting to reform, trying to create distance for a fighting withdrawal. The human ships pursued with cold efficiency, not giving them space to regroup. It wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. The Council needed to learn that aggression against free species carried a price. The hegemony fleet arrived 2 hours into the battle and immediately reversed course. Their commander had watched the Vesk get dismantled and decided that discretion was preferable to destruction. They broadcast no demands, made no threats. They simply ran. By the time the shooting stopped, the Vesk had lost 42 capital ships and 3 times that many support vessels. Human casualties were minimal. Some shield damage, 2 frigates requiring repairs, 0 fatalities. The message couldn't have been clearer. Humanity wasn't just capable of defending itself, it was capable of projecting power, of defending allies, of making the Council bleed for its aggression. The aftermath came fast. Within 24 hours, 9 species announced their withdrawal from the Council. Within a week, it was 34. The carefully constructed hierarchy that had maintained galactic order for 60 millennia was collapsing like a structure built on sand. The Council's response was predictable. They attempted to negotiate. The Xanthari High Arbiter herself reached out through back-channel communications, requesting a dialogue with Secretary-General Okoye. Patricia had forwarded the request to Thomas. Now he sat in a private communication room, watching the Arbiter's holographic image materialize across from him. She looked older than he remembered, the harmonics of her voice carrying undertones of exhaustion. "Ambassador Garrett," she said. "Or should I say Minister Garrett? I understand you've accepted a position in the new human government structure." "Minister of External Affairs," Thomas confirmed. The promotion had come 3 months ago. Recognition of his role in building the alliance that was now reshaping galactic politics. "What can I do for you, Arbiter?" "You can help us find a path forward that doesn't result in galactic war," she said bluntly. 57 species have withdrawn from Council authority in the past 2 months. Trade networks are collapsing. Security cooperation has broken down. There are regions of space descending into chaos because local authorities no longer recognize Council jurisdiction. "Sounds like the natural consequence of building a system on exploitation and fear," Thomas said. He kept his voice level, professional, but he couldn't quite suppress the edge of satisfaction. The Arbiter's harmonics took on a sharp tone. "We offered structure, order, protection for 60,000 years. The Council has maintained peace." "For the powerful," Thomas interrupted. "The Council maintained peace for species at the top of the hierarchy. Everyone else got stability at the cost of autonomy, protection in exchange for subordination. That's not peace. That's occupation with better public relations." The Arbiter was silent for a long moment. "What do you want, Minister Garrett? What would it take for humanity to stop encouraging species to abandon the Council?" Thomas had prepared for this question. He'd spent weeks in strategy sessions with Patricia, with Admiral Chen, with representatives from allied species, mapping out what a sustainable galactic order might look like. "Dissolution," he said simply. The Arbiter's image flickered slightly, whether from technological interference or shock, Thomas couldn't tell. "You want us to dissolve the Galactic Council?" "The Council as it currently exists is irredeemable," Thomas said. "It's built on principles that ensure inequality, structured to maintain the dominance of founding species while exploiting everyone else. You can't reform that. You can only replace it." "Replace it with what? Human hegemony?" Thomas shook his head. "Replace it with something genuinely cooperative. An alliance of sovereign species, each maintaining full autonomy, joining together for mutual benefit rather than because they're forced to. No hierarchy, no permanent seats with veto power, no regulations that apply to some species but not others." "That's chaos," the Arbiter said. "Without structure, without authority. Galactic civilization will fragment into endless conflict." "Or it will evolve into something better," Thomas countered. "You're assuming that species can't cooperate unless they're forced to. But look at what we've built in 5 years. 34 species working together, coordinating trade and security without anyone holding a gun to their heads. It's not perfect, but it's based on choice rather than coercion. The Arbiter's harmonics shifted to something that might have been desperation. The founding species will never agree to dissolution. They've held power for too long to surrender it voluntarily. Then they'll be left behind, Thomas said. The species withdrawing from the Council aren't asking for permission. They're taking their freedom. The founding species can either adapt to the new reality, or they can cling to a dying system until it collapses completely around them. You're condemning the galaxy to war, the Arbiter said. We're offering the galaxy a choice, Thomas corrected. Submit to the old order or join something new. Some species will choose war, but I think you'll find that most prefer freedom. The conversation continued for another hour, the Arbiter probing for compromise, Thomas remaining firm. By the end, they'd agreed to nothing except to keep talking. But Thomas knew the real negotiation wasn't happening in private channels. It was happening across the galaxy, species by species, as governments weighed their options and chose their futures. 3 months later, Thomas found himself back in space, but this time traveling toward a very different kind of assembly. The founding species of the Galactic Council had agreed to a summit, a last-ditch attempt to salvage their authority. They'd invited representatives from the breakaway species, probably hoping to negotiate individual settlements that would fragment the independence movement. They were in for a surprise. Thomas's ship docked at the neutral station where the summit was being held. He wore the formal uniform of Earth's Ministry of External Affairs now, black with silver trim, the blue marble of Earth prominent on his shoulder. He wasn't alone. Subqueen Tresk walked beside him, along with High Coordinator Vess, Minister Kelvin, Dr. Venn, and representatives from 43 other species. They entered the conference hall together. A united front that made the council representatives visibly uncomfortable. The Vesk ambassador was there, mandibles clicking nervously. The Trell Trade Federation had sent their senior ministers. The Hegemony Military Command occupied an entire section. And at the center, the founding species sat in positions of prominence they'd held for 60,000 years. The Xanthari High Arbiter called the summit to order. "We are here to discuss the future of galactic governance," she began, her harmonics carefully modulated for diplomacy. "The recent upheavals have created uncertainty and instability. We believe that through dialogue and compromise, we can find a path forward that serves all species." Thomas stood. "We agree," he said, "which is why we're proposing the formal dissolution of the Galactic Council and the establishment of a new framework for interstellar cooperation." The hall erupted in protests and objections. Thomas waited for the noise to die down. "For 60,000 years, you've maintained a system that benefits the few at the expense of the many," he continued once he could be heard. "You've used regulations to strangle competitors, used military force to intimidate dissenters, and used economic pressure to maintain control. That system is ending, not because we're destroying it, but because species are choosing to leave it." He activated a holographic display showing the current state of galactic politics. More than half of former council space was now governed by independent coalitions or bilateral agreements outside council authority. "You can either accept this reality and work with us to build something better," Thomas said, "or you can fight to preserve a system that's already dead. Choose wisely." 10 years after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, Thomas stood in a garden on Earth, watching his granddaughter chase butterflies through flowering plants that had been genetically engineered to thrive in low-gravity environments. She was 4 years old, born in a universe where the Council's authority was a historical footnote rather than an oppressive reality. She would never know what it meant to defer to alien powers, to accept subordinate status, to watch her species be judged and found wanting by those who feared human potential. The summit had ended with neither victory nor defeat, but with exhaustion. The founding species had refused to formally dissolve the council, clinging to the fiction of their authority, even as their actual power evaporated. They maintained their grand assembly halls, held their votes, passed their resolutions. And they were increasingly ignored by a galaxy that had discovered alternatives. The new order wasn't a single institution, but a web of relationships, bilateral agreements, and regional coalitions that allowed species to cooperate without surrendering sovereignty. The Kalesh, Gen, Dressi, Nim, and 47 other species had formed the Independent Systems Compact, a mutual defense and trade alliance built on principles of equality and voluntary cooperation. Humanity was part of it, but not at its center. That had been important to Thomas, proving that the point wasn't to replace council hegemony with human dominance, but to create systems where dominance itself wasn't necessary. Trade flourished without council regulations strangling innovation. Technology advanced as species shared knowledge freely, rather than hoarding it for competitive advantage. There were disputes, certainly, conflicts over resources and territory and incompatible values. But they were resolved through negotiation between equals, rather than imposed by overwhelming force. The founding species watched from their diminishing territories, still powerful enough to be dangerous, but no longer dominant enough to control. Some had adapted, joining the new networks on equal terms. Others remained isolated, nursing grievances and plotting returns to lost glory that would never come. Thomas's communicator chimed. He glanced at it, then smiled. A message from Rebecca Martinez, who now served as humanity's ambassador to the Independent Systems Compact. She was reporting from the inaugural meeting of the Interspecies Coordination Assembly, a new body designed to facilitate cooperation on galaxy-wide challenges without the hierarchy and exploitation that had defined the Council. 73 species represented, Rebecca's message read, including 3 of the Council founding species. They're calling it observer status, but we all know what it really means. They're coming around. Thomas typed back. About time. Only took them a decade to realize the galaxy moved on without them. His granddaughter ran up to him, breathless with excitement, holding a blue butterfly cupped carefully in her small hands. "Grandpa, look! I caught one!" Thomas knelt down to her level, examining the butterfly with appropriate solemnity. "That's a Luna Blue," he told her. "They were almost extinct 100 years ago, but we brought them back using genetic archives and careful breeding." "Why were they extinct?" she asked, her young face scrunching with concern. "Because people weren't paying attention," Thomas said. "They were focused on other things and didn't notice the damage they were doing until it was almost too late." She considered this seriously, then carefully opened her hands to let the butterfly go. It circled once around her head before flying off toward the flower beds. "We should always pay attention," she said, with the absolute certainty of childhood. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "We should." Patricia Okoye found him an hour later, walking through the garden paths. She was 81 now, serving her 4th term as Secretary General, still sharp and formidable despite her age. She moved slowly, favoring a hip that nanotechnology could repair, but that she refused to let doctors touch. "It reminds me I'm mortal," she'd said when Thomas had asked. "Leaders should remember mortality." "Beautiful day," Patricia said, settling onto a bench beside him. "Hard to believe this garden is on a space station." They were on Harmony Station, humanity's largest orbital facility, a massive ring that housed 30,000 permanent residents and served as the administrative center for Earth's interstellar operations. The garden occupied 2 full levels. An engineering marvel that provided psychological respite from the artificial environment. "I got a message from the VESC this morning," Patricia said. "An official apology for their actions during the withdrawal crisis. They're requesting normalization of relations. Thomas felt something twist in his chest, a complex emotion he couldn't quite name. 10 years later, they're apologizing. Better late than never, Patricia said, though I suspect it's less about genuine remorse and more about economic necessity. They need access to our markets. What did you tell them? That we'd consider it, Patricia replied. After appropriate conditions are met. Reparations to the Kalesh for the attempted invasion. Formal recognition of the Independent Systems Compact. A few other items that will take them years to fulfill. Thomas nodded. It was the right approach. Not revenge, but accountability. The Vesk needed to understand that actions had consequences, that you couldn't attempt to crush a species and then expect friendly relations a decade later without making amends. The historians are calling it the Great Fracture, Patricia said. The moment when galactic civilization fundamentally changed course. They're comparing it to the fall of empires throughout human history. What do you think it was? Thomas asked. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, watching birds that had been imported from Earth flutter between the trees. I think it was inevitable, she said finally. The Council's model was always unsustainable. You can't maintain a hierarchy based on age and military power forever. Not when younger species keep developing capabilities that challenge the established order. We just happened to be the catalyst. We were the ones stubborn enough not to accept our place, Thomas said. Stubborn enough to believe we deserved better, Patricia corrected. There's a difference. Thomas thought about the past decade. The battles fought and won. The alliances built and maintained. The slow, grinding work of constructing new systems to replace old ones. It hadn't been glorious. Most of it had been tedious negotiations and administrative logistics, the unglamorous work of governance that never made it into historical narratives. But it had mattered. Do you think it was worth it? Patricia asked. Everything we gave up, everything we risked, the lives lost in the Battle of Kesh Prime, the economic disruption, the uncertainty. Thomas looked at his granddaughter, still chasing butterflies without a care in the universe, growing up free in ways his generation had never been. Yes, he said simply. It was worth it. Patricia smiled, the expression carrying decades of exhaustion and satisfaction in equal measure. Good, because I'm retiring next year, and I'm recommending you as my successor. Thomas turned to stare at her. You're what? Retiring, Patricia repeated calmly. I've been doing this job for 20 years. It's time for someone else to carry the weight. You've spent a decade building the new order. You should lead it into whatever comes next. I'm 63 years old, Thomas protested. I was planning to retire myself. Spend time with my family. You're 63 and in perfect health, thanks to the same nanomedical technology you helped make available to half the galaxy, Patricia interrupted. You've got another 40 good years in you, probably more. And more importantly, you understand what we built and why it matters. That's not common. Thomas wanted to argue, to explain all the reasons why he wasn't the right choice, why someone younger and more energetic should take the role. But looking at Patricia's expression, he knew the decision was already made. She wasn't asking. She was informing him. You're a tyrant, he said without heat. I'm practical, Patricia corrected. The galaxy needs continuity right now. Someone who remembers why we walked away, who can explain it to the next generation, who won't be tempted to compromise the principles we established just for short-term gain. She stood slowly, preparing to leave. Think about it. But not for too long. I'm announcing my retirement in 3 months, and I'd prefer to tell people who's replacing me. Thomas watched her go, feeling the weight of what she'd just laid on him settling across his shoulders. Secretary General of Earth. Leader of the most powerful independent species in the galaxy. Steward of the new order they'd built from the ruins of the old. His granddaughter ran up again, this time holding a flower she'd picked. "For you, Grandpa," she said, presenting it with immense pride. Thomas took the flower, a simple blue bloom that probably violated a dozen regulations about picking station flora. "Thank you, sweetheart. It's beautiful." "Like you," she said, then giggled at her own joke before running off again. Thomas held the flower carefully, thinking about gardens and butterflies and the futures we build for those who come after us. He thought about walking away from the council chamber 10 years ago, carrying the weight of humanity's dignity in a data chip and a few carefully chosen words. He thought about the battles fought and the alliances forged and the slow, patient work of building something better than what came before. And he thought about his granddaughter, chasing butterflies in a garden on a space station, free in ways that previous generations could only dream about. Patricia was right. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. Each generation would face their own challenges, their own moments when they had to choose between comfort and principle, between acceptance and freedom. But that was the point. They would have the choice. That's what humanity had won when they walked away quietly and forced the galaxy to see its blunder. The choice to be free. Thomas tucked the flower into his jacket pocket and pulled out his communicator. He typed a message to Patricia. "I'll do it, but only if you agree to serve as an advisor. I'm not carrying this weight alone." Her response came immediately. "Deal. Welcome to the hardest job in human space." Thomas smiled, watching his